Once I thought that to be human was the highest aim a man could have, but I see now that it was meant to destroy me. Today I'm proud to say that I am inhuman, that I belong not to men and governments, that I have nothing to do with creeds and principles. I have nothing to do with the creaking machinery of humanity. I belong to the earth. I say that lying on my pillow, and I can feel the horns sprouting from my temples. I can see about me all those cracked forebears of mine dancing around the bed, consoling me, egging me on, lashing me with their serpent tongues, grinning and leering at me with their skulking skulls. I am inhuman. I say it with a mad, hallucinated grin, and I will keep on saying it though it rain crocodiles. Behind my words are all those grinning, leering, skulking skulls, some dead and grinning a long time, some grinning as if they had lockjaw, some grinning with the grimace of a grin, the foretaste and aftermath of what is always going on. Clearer than all I see my own grinning skull, see the skeleton dancing in the wind, serpents issuing from the rotted tongue and the bloated pages of ecstasy slimed with excrement. And I join my slime, my excrement, my madness, my ecstasy to the great circuit which flows through the subterranean vaults of the flesh. All this unbidden, unwanted, drunken vomit will flow on endlessly through the minds of those to come in the inexhaustible vessel that contains the history of the race. Side by side with the human race, there runs another race of beings, the inhuman ones, the race of artists who, goaded by unknown impulses, take the lifeless mass of humanity and by the fever and ferment with which they imbue it, turn the soggy dough into bread, and the bread into wine, and the wine into song. Out of the dead compost and the inert slag, they breed a song that contaminates. I see this other race of individuals ransacking the universe, turning everything upside down, their feet always moving in blood and tears, their hands always empty, always clutching and grasping for the beyond, for the God out of reach, slaying everything within reach in order to quiet the monster that gnaws at their vitals. I see that when they tear their hair with the effort to comprehend, to seize this forever unattainable, I see that when they bellow like crazed beasts and rip and gore, I see that this is right, that there is no other path to pursue. A man who belongs to this race must stand up on the high place with gibberish in his mouth and rip out his entrails. It is right and just because he must. And anything that falls short of this frightening spectacle, anything less shuddering, less terrifying, less mad, less intoxicated, less contaminating, is not art. The rest is counterfeit. The rest is human. The rest belongs to life and lifelessness. Welcome to the Books of Some Substance podcast. I'm your host, David Southard.
And I'm your host, Nathan Sharp. And today we're talking about the ever controversial was published, controversial today, Henry Miller's Tropic of Cancer. So this novel was written in the 1930s, published in 1934 in Paris, and it was immediately banned in the UK and in America, and wasn't published in the United States until 1961. The book follows, it's a sort of autobiographical, quite autobiographical. The main character is actually Henry Miller, and it follows him as he's bumming around Paris in the early 1930s, looking for something to eat, a crummy hotel room to sleep in, something to drink, a woman to sleep with, and these sort of vignettes of life in the crusty side of Paris. But interspersed with these scenes and these crusty characters are his ecstatic, psychedelic essays on living the creative life. And it's this peculiar combination of what I would call somewhat pornographic scenes and this philosophy that makes this book so strange and so interesting, and I think was part of what made it compelling then and still compelling now. And this is going to be an interesting conversation. David, I think the place that would be good to start is just talking about the relevance. Like initially, if for somebody who knows about this book, they know the reputation of this book. I don't know how often this book is read. There's elements of it that certainly don't seem in vogue. I mean, let's not sugarcoat it. It's sexist, it's racist, it's crude, it's vulgar, and all of that holds up. Like, I mean, there are parts that are uncomfortable to read, and I wouldn't want somebody looking over my shoulder while I read it.
Yeah, I would say those aspects are even more apparent now than ever before, because I imagine back then some of these thoughts, some of these words were held by quite a few people. And it's not those aspects that got the book banned, I think. I think it was, like you said, the pornographic parts, but we can get into the pornographic parts because I don't think those are necessarily meant to titillate. They certainly may do that if you're, a horny young teenage boy who likes poetry somehow at the same time. Like I was when I first read this book at 18. I was like, oh, wow, this is, it's exciting, it's thrilling. But reading it now, you're like, oh, you know, it's filthy, it's gross. There's no passion in it. It's all just, and he gets into that. We can go in, it's very mechanical at times. But in terms of relevance, I'm not sure what you mean, like relevance to the world of letters and literature, or
I guess maybe this is a bit of a big question to start off on. I think there's my perspective on Henry Miller before reading this book, and we've talked about Henry Miller before. You've read him in the past. I've read some of his essays, and I really liked his essays, but I'd never read his fiction or autobiographical fiction before. So, and the parts that I had read were very much about the creativity, the parts, and he writes very beautifully about what it means to be an artist. What that worldview is.
yeah. So like when you see Miller in the world of social media, like this very morning, someone posted a meme of some NPC character crying, saying, I hate my life. And then there's a picture of Miller next to it. And it's his famous quote, a quote that I once, maybe not so ashamedly, but somewhat ashamedly had on my wall as a young man, was the aim of life is to be aware, drunkenly, violently, serenely aware, or something. I can't remember the exact quote off the top of my head, and it was like this idea that Miller has in a lot of his writing, which is about finding passion and pursuing life vigorously despite the cesspool that is most of society. So when you see Miller, if you see him at all nowadays, you see a sort of scrubbed, clean, almost motivational type character, which he certainly has that aspect in him, and it's in that book. But it's not a clean.
Yeah, and I guess I'm interested in trying to talk about the whole Henry Miller, because I think it does him an injustice to scrub away the filth. Personally, and having read this, and I don't know that I really love this book. I found it quite uneven, actually, and I wasn't really sure how to take it, because there's passages like the one you started, that you read at the very beginning, that I love, but then there's other parts I'm like, I'm not really getting much out of this. And
sitting and talking to Ben Norton about See You Next Tuesdays.
About all the See You Next Tuesdays. And for the listener, there's a lot of See You Next Tuesday. I just learned this phrase. Just to keep this episode PG, we're gonna
try
to keep. Yeah. But do you want to just read a sample of that? Do you know where that Van Norden section is?
I mean, there's a lot of it. So there's, in our book, which is this one that we are reading from. I don't know if you're reading from the same.
Yeah. With the bold typography.
And, Grove Press.
Trade Gothic, and there's a black and white sepia photo of a naked woman.
Yeah. So I believe around 144, there's a lot of Van Norden in this section of the book, early 100s. And this is when he is watching Van Norton sleep with another person. He's getting into a fight with a woman, I think it's a prostitute, about 15 francs. And he says, as I watch Van Norden tackle her, it seems to me that I'm looking at a machine whose cogs have slipped. Left to themselves, they could go on this way forever, grinding and slipping, without ever anything happening, until a hand shuts the motor off. The sight of them coupled like a pair of goats without the least spark of passion, grinding and grinding away for no reason except the 15 francs, washes away every bit of feeling I have except the inhuman one of satisfying my curiosity. The girl is lying on the edge of the bed, and Van Norden is bent over her like a satyr, with his 2 feet solidly planted on the floor. I'm sitting on a chair behind them, watching their movements with a cool, scientific detachment. It doesn't matter to me if it should last forever. It's like watching one of those crazy machines which throw the newspaper out. Maybe that's not the best one.
That one gets to the sort of the how dispassionate some of the sex is in this. How pretty universally the women are treated as non-characters, almost inhuman characters.
Oddly, the most he has a respect for the prostitute Germaine. I don't know how to pronounce the French. Early in the book, this is around page 45 or so, he's comparing these 2 prostitutes that he meets and talks about. One is Claude and one is Germaine. And it says, Germaine was a whore all the way through, even down to her good heart. Her whore's heart, which is not really a good heart, but a lazy one, an indifferent, flaccid heart that can be touched for a moment. A heart without reference to any fixed point within, a big, flaccid whore's heart that can detach itself for a moment from its true center. However vile and circumscribed was that world which she had created for herself, nevertheless she functioned in it superbly, and that in itself is a tonic thing. And later, he says, when she lay there with her legs apart and moaning, even if she did moan that way for any and everybody, it was good and it was a proper show of feeling. She didn't stare up at the ceiling with a vacant look or count the bed bugs on the wallpaper. She kept her mind on her business. She talked about the things a man wants to hear when he's climbing over a woman. Whereas Cloud, there was always a certain delicacy, even when she got under the sheets with you, and her delicacy offended. Who wants a delicate whore? Cloud would even ask you to turn your face away when she squatted over the bidet. All wrong. A man, when he's burning up with passion, wants to see things. He wants to see everything, even how they make water. And while it's all very nice to know that a woman has a mind, literature coming from the cold corpse of a whore is the last thing to be served in bed. Germaine had the right idea. She was ignorant and lusty. She put her heart and soul into her work. She was a whore all the way through, and that was her virtue.
And I think, those are two of the tamer passages. I'm looking for a real raunchy one.
I mean, those are hard for us to read, I think.
Well, maybe we'll come across one while we're talking, and we can it out just for the so our listeners can get a real sense of full spectrum that's at play here. Also, I just saw this. The original, I think Tropic of Cancer is a great title.
Yeah.
It does. I didn't understand it. It just has an aura. Tropic of Cancer. It's a place. What is that? He talks about the cancers, the crab. But his working title for it was Crazy Cock, which is about as bad as Tropic of Cancer is good.
Yeah.
For a title.
Actually, I believe he wrote a book called Crazy Cock, an early book, right?
I've seen that said too, but I kind of think I've also heard him say that was the title for this, and he says it in this book. I kind of think that was a book that he wrote that didn't get published that later became Tropic of Cancer.
I see. Because it is published as a book.
Oh, it is?
Yeah. And it's apparently told in the third person, and it's more novelistic and less.
Oh, interesting. So I want to talk a little bit about what was happening in 1934, because I think that I just read this essay by George Orwell, which I think if anybody has read Henry Miller or is interested in Henry Miller, I would recommend reading this essay, Inside the Whale, which Orwell wrote several years later in 1940. and it's about this book, and it's about kind of the state of art and the world. It's an incredible essay. But what he did for me in this essay was help me understand sort of what was going on when Henry Miller wrote this, and why did it send such shockwaves through the art world, in spite of it being nearly impossible to get your hands on, which he also addresses in the essay, which is kind of funny. He's like, with a little determination and a little over, twice the price you should be paying for it, you'll be able to find this book. But do you know what was happening in 1934? Do you know what major world event happened in 1934? Hitler became the Führer of Germany. And that's the nature of this essay. It is what was happening. There was so much happening in the world. There was so much conflict happening in the world. I mean, Hitler became Führer in 1934, but his rise to power was being followed. The rise of fascism. Orwell actually met Henry Miller when he was on his way to fight the fascists in Spain. Miller famously told him, only an idiot would go to Spain to fight the fascists.
That sounds very much like a Henry Miller thing to say.
And so the whole world was caught up in politics, in the rise of communism, the rise of socialism, the downfall of capitalism, the rise of Hitler. And as Orwell tells it, there was no good fiction written in the 30s. And in this desert of fiction, Henry Miller drops Tropic of Cancer, which is so inward looking. It's so narcissistic. It's so hedonistic. You could read it, and I think in my reading, it's hard to imagine that this was written almost 100 years ago. The language and racism, sexism aside, a lot of it still feels like transgressive. I mean, it's still a transgressive novel, but it still feels relevant in a way. It feels like you're still battling, am I living an honest, authentic life? You're not thinking about who's rising to power in Spain. Or I'm not. Most of us aren't. And he kind of just ignores everything that's going on outside of his immediate periphery.
Yeah. And seems to purposely put himself into the world where that's possible. He's not trying to make money, or if it is, it's money just enough for a good meal and a good whore. That's about it.
Yeah.
His words,
or a bad meal and a bad whore.
Yeah, honestly, yeah. By the way, his meal plan scenario that he comes up with is very cool, very funny. Do you remember that earlier?
What was it?
When he writes letters to people because he realizes that people are annoyed with him showing up. So he writes a letter, can I have dinner with you one day a week? And setting up this schedule of one day a week going to this person's house, to this family's house, he becomes like this guest, and they like to provide food for him, and they're curious, oh, where do you eat on Wednesdays? Do they cook good food? And not having to deal with him just showing up randomly and trying to bum something from them, they're almost relieved to help him out once a week. And that way he knows that he'll be fed one day or each day at night somewhere. Yeah, I thought it was funny. Anyway, but yeah, he seems to sort of build this life for himself, because any other kind of existence would be human to him. And he does not feel that, and he does not want to be that, even though he's driven by very human desires, very human needs, like sex, food.
Yeah, well, it's funny that he says that. How do you take that?
So,
because it seems like what he's driven by, these base impulses which seem fundamentally human, and driven away from this sort of like group action, politics, broader culture and society, obligation, modernity, which is he saying that is humanity?
I think so. I think the individual and the individual needs are more important than society's functioning or society's needs, and that the functioning of society as this whirling machine of horribleness that he describes, it deadens you, and that those base needs are sometimes the only real thing you have.
Well, it's a funny use of language, and it almost makes me wonder if it's a way of sort of giving the middle finger to the sort of the censors or the polite society, which is like, where's your humanity? Where's your humanity? Why don't you care? And he's like, I am the devil. If you want to make me the devil, I am the devil. I'd rather be the devil than to participate in your humanity, which is maybe provocative, because maybe to say that it is human to spend your life worrying about what's happening on the other side of the globe is also provocative language, trying to get you to associate your own self, your own needs with some abstract idea, Marxism or fascism or whatever, like trying to get you to associate being human with something that's just an idea is also provocative. It's like, well, screw that.
He talks about this a little bit. This is on page 97. I might bounce around a little bit, but somehow the realization that nothing was to be hoped for had a salutary effect upon me. For weeks and months, for years in fact, all my life, I had been looking forward to something happening, some extrinsic event that would alter my life, and now suddenly, inspired by the absolute hopelessness of everything, I felt relieved, felt as though a great burden had been lifted from my shoulders. And he kind of goes on to the next page. Nothing that had happened to me thus far had been sufficient to destroy me. Nothing had been destroyed except my illusions. I myself was intact. The world was intact. Tomorrow there might be a revolution, a plague, an earthquake. Tomorrow there might not be left a single soul to whom one could turn for sympathy, for aid, for faith. It seemed to me that the great calamity had already manifested itself, that I could be no more truly alone than at this very moment. I made up my mind that I would hold on to nothing, that I would expect nothing, that henceforth I would live as an animal, a beast of prey, a rover, a plunderer. Even if war were declared and it were my lot to go, I would grab the bayonet and plunge it up to the hilt. And if rape were the order of the day, then rape I would, and with a vengeance. At this very moment, in the quiet dawn of a new day, was not the earth giddy with crime and distress? Had one single element of man's nature been altered, vitally, fundamentally altered by the incessant march of history? By what he calls the better part of his nature, man has been betrayed, that is all. In the extreme limits of his spiritual being, man finds himself again naked as a savage. When he finds God, as it were, he had been picked clean. He is a skeleton. One must burrow into life again in order to put on flesh. The word must become flesh. The soul thirsts. And whatever crumb my eye fastens, I will pounce and devour. If to live is the paramount thing, then I will live, even if I must become a cannibal. Henceforth, I've been trying to save my precious hide, trying to preserve the few pieces of meat that hid my bones. I'm done with that. I've reached the limits of endurance. My back is to the wall. I can retreat no further. As far as history goes, I'm dead. If there's something beyond, I shall have to bounce back. I have found God, but he is insufficient. I am only spiritually dead. Physically, I'm alive. Morally, I am free. The world which I have departed is a menagerie. The dawn is breaking on a new world, a jungle world in which the lean spirits roam with sharp claws. If I am a hyena, I am a lean and hungry one. I go forth to fatten myself. His philosophy on selfishness, I guess.
Yeah, and if I can add just a short passage to that on the page before, I kind of in this same. On the meridian of time, there is no injustice. There is only the poetry of motion, creating the illusion of truth and drama. If at any moment, anywhere, one comes face to face with the absolute, that great sympathy which makes men like Gautama and Jesus seem divine freezes away. The monstrous thing is not that men have created roses out of this dung heap, but that, for some reason or other, they should want roses. And I think that this section, it does speak to his sort of aggressive passivism or passiveness. Like you are caught in this time, just accept it. Whatever it is, aggressively accept the situation that you're in. Well, maybe there's a sort of there is a very clear action that he takes. I mean, he cuts his life off. He leaves his wife, leaves his child to live with his mistress, and then leaves his mistress, or who he later marries his mistress, Mona or Mara. I can't remember what she is in this book, Mona, and moves to Paris and leaves her and kind of thinks about her sometimes. But he's like, oh yeah, I have a wife, but obviously isn't especially faithful to her. So he makes some decisions, and he's pursuing some idea of that he has of a right life. But I think that I want to talk about this too, the aspect of Henry Miller being a moralist, because I think he is. But it's towards this state that he describes in this passage that we read. I think that he's trying to move away from obligations, away from these structures that tell him how to live, to a place where he can just live authentically from himself, which is also I think to ignore those structures. It's like if you get caught up in war, then you're in war, but you don't go seeking it out. You don't go to Spain to fight against the fascists. That's if you're in Spain and the fascists come, then you fight, but you don't go to Spain to fight the fascists. That's nonsense in his philosophy. And I think that this comes back to kind of what's the continued relevance of Henry Miller and this essay by Orwell. Are you going to live your life politically? Or are you going to align yourself with a political party? You're going to censor yourself for the benefit of some, utopia somewhere down the road? Or are you going to say, they're going to say it's wrong now. Maybe they'll say it's right tomorrow. Whatever I'm doing right now, they're going to say it's wrong tomorrow. So I'm just going to do whatever seems right to me now. Whatever, I'm going to be that hyena and just go out there and live my life in this animalistic way.
So isn't that a morality of relativism then?
I don't think so. I mean, I wouldn't define it as such, because I don't think that Henry Miller, his philosophy really extends to how other people or other people's ideas. Relativism would be to say, well, this is just as good as that. I don't think he makes that claim.
So it's pure individualism then, or egoism.
Yeah, he's often seen as an amoralist or immoral, really. And I think he describes himself in sort of amoralistic ways. But I think, on the other hand, he's also a sort of mystic. He's also sort of advocating a direct relationship with God, so to speak, a direct relationship with your nature. Like, forego the Catholic Church, forego the state. You don't need an intermediary to tell you what reality is. You just need to look at yourself and be honest with yourself. And don't pretend that you're not thinking racist thoughts or thinking sexist thoughts, or that shit doesn't come out of your anus. Don't pretend that these facts aren't real. Just look at it. That's what you are. And then when you look at it, you look at yourself as you are. You also find your relationship with God. And that's the moral aspect of it to me. And that connects him, for all of his filth and vulgarity and profanity, with the mystics through the ages.
He was often, it seems from what I've read about him, that people would view him as a sage, his friends, his family, as this imparter of some kind of deeper wisdom. And I think in a way that is perfect for him and true to what he writes about, you have to wade through all of that vulgarity, all of that profanity to get at it. Because that is life. There's no escaping that.
It's part of it.
Yeah.
I mean, even if it's not part of some, well, there are prostitutes on my street, but that's a different issue.
Yeah.
I'm not living Henry Miller's life. It's not my reality what he describes. But I think that him saying, this is also part of reality, and I'm okay with it. I Henry Miller, am okay with it. There's a sort of, having read this, and I'm reading Sexist now, there's a sort of like letting down of the guard. It's like, when you have that friend who's just so much worse than you are, that he's not going to judge you. Whatever you do or say, he's not going to judge you because he's done so much worse. Henry Miller is kind of like that, but then he also kind of like gets you in your spiritual and creative aspects as well.
There's an exuberance to all of the madness and to all of the vulgarity and joy and everything else in between in life that he expresses and that he recognizes. There's a few passages. There's one early on where someone calls him an optimist, or I can't remember his like nature. Do you remember what I'm talking about?
That's not ringing a bell.
So walking along the Champs-Elysees, I keep thinking of my really superb health. When I say health, I mean optimism. To be truthful, incurably optimistic. Still have 1 foot in the 19th century. I'm a bit retarded like most Americans. Carl finds it disgusting, this optimism. I have only to talk about a meal, he say, and you're radiant. It's a fact. The mere thought of a meal, another meal rejuvenates me. A meal. That means something to go on, a few solid hours of work, an erection possibly. I don't deny it. I have health, good, solid animal health. The only thing that stands between me and a future is a meal, another meal. There's different things like that throughout the book. And, part of that same passage. I've been all over that ground years and years ago. I've lived out my melancholy youth. I don't give a fuck anymore what's behind me or what's ahead of me. I'm healthy, incurably healthy. No sorrows, no regrets, no past, no future. The present is enough for me, day by day, today. La belle aujourd'hui. Yeah, so really, he's a Buddhist.
Was he actually a Buddhist?
I don't think so.
Was he a Taoist?
I think he dabbled in a lot of that stuff and makes reference to it quite often in some of his work. But, yeah. I mean, like his personal life sounds pretty chaotic. He was married 7 times, has multiple children. He seems pretty close to the character, if it is a character, in the book.
Do you think, let's talk about this for a second. Do you think, how autobiographical
I would say
is this book?
Fairly. It seems, from everything I've read about him, it seems fairly autobiographical. I mean, I think there's exaggerations and flights of fancy and surrealism and all that sort of stuff, but in terms of like his day-to-day existence, probably pretty close. I know he worked for a newspaper at one point. He did travel to, I think, Dijon or some city to try teach English at one point. Time frame and, maybe main events probably seem pretty accurate. And then, of course, there's, I think, a ton of embellishment on character.
Yeah. You mean on the characters that he encounters around him?
Yeah, I'm sure.
But they also represent real people, right?
I believe so, yes.
You want to talk about his language a little bit? Because I think that struck me. I mean, obviously, there's the vulgarity in his language and how shocking that was to, the literary world. I keep referencing this Orwell essay, but something Orwell said was that when the book came out, that people had either the reaction of, oh, it's just pornography, and the easiest thing to do is to write a sensational book that's pornographic, and then it gets, sensationalized because of that. Or, maybe that excites you, and, oh, this person's breaking the rules and therefore it's good or whatever. But then, yeah, he argues that the value of the book isn't actually either of those things. And aside from that aspect of the language, there's a lot of surrealism and sort of experimental writing, which I wasn't so much expecting.
Yeah, there's moments, I think, like you said, there's the sort of philosophical asides, which we've read a few of so far, which are really interesting and I think the best part of the book. Then there's the vile, pornographic, him dealing with his friends, dealing with prostitutes or the women that they're sleeping with, and that I think is the weakest aspect of the book. And then there's these occasional moments of poetry and beauty in surreal writing. He has a knack for writing. I think he's an excellent writer, actually, in parts. It's not, and in a way, we kind of joked that it reminds us of Proust in that way, that there can be passages that are dull and repetitive. And while Prousts tend to take place inside of salons and Miller's take place on bug infested beds and deal with a lot of, it's so hard for me not to say the word cock and cunt, but because those are the words that he uses so much, but a lot of vulgarity, we'll call it that. But yeah, I think there's two things I want to sort of get at. Maybe the Proust connection and his reference to Proust, which is, I think, a beautiful moment of poetry and writing. And then also the surreal. Where do you want to start?
Well, I was looking for that passage that you mentioned right before we started recording about where he's staring at the vagina and has a revelation. So I feel like that brings together a lot.
I mean, it goes on for pages, but it starts on 246.
Okay. The girls have undressed and we are examining the floor to make sure that they won't get any splinters in their ass. They are still wearing their high-heeled shoes, but the ass is worn down, scraped, sandpapered, smooth, hard, bright as a billiard ball or the skull of a leper. On the wall is Mona's picture. She is facing northeast on a line with Krakow written in green ink. To the left of her is the Dardone, encircled with a red pencil. Suddenly I see a dark, hairy crack in front of me, set in a bright, polished billiard ball. The legs are holding me like a pair of scissors. A glance at that dark, unstitched wound and a deep fissure in my brain opens up. All the images and memories that had been laboriously or absent-mindedly assorted, labeled, documented, filed, sealed, and stamped break forth pell-mell like ants pouring out of a crack in the sidewalk. The world ceases to revolve. Time stops. The very nexus of my dreams is broken and dissolved, and my guts spill out in a grand schizophrenic rush. An evacuation that leaves me face to face with the absolute. I see again the great sprawling mothers of Picasso, their breasts covered with spiders, their legend hidden deep in the labyrinth. And Molly Bloom lying on a dirty mattress for eternity. On the toilet door, red chalk cocks, and the Madonna uttering the diapason of woe. I hear a wild, hysterical laugh, a room full of lockjaw, and the body that was black glows like phosphorus. Wild, wild, utterly uncontrollable laughter, and that crack laughing at me too, laughing through the mossy whiskers, a laugh that creases the bright, polished surface of the billiard ball. Great whore and mother of man with gin in her veins, mother of all harlots, spider rolling us in your logarithmic grave, insatiable one, fiend whose laughter rives me. I look down into that sunken crater, world lost and without traces, and I hear the bells chiming. 2 nuns at the Palace Stanislas, and the smell of rancid butter under their dresses. Manifesto, never printed because it was raining. War fought to further the cause of plastic surgery. The Prince of Wales flying around the world decorating the graves of unknown heroes. Every bat flying out of the belfry a lost cause. Every hoopla a groan over the radio from the private trenches of the damned. Out of that dark, unstitched wound, that sink of abomination, that cradle of black-thronged cities where the music of ideas is drowned in cold fat. Out of strangled utopias is born a clown, a being divided between beauty and ugliness, between light and chaos. A clown who, when we look down and sidelong, is Satan himself, and when he looks upwards, he's a buttered angel, a snail with wings. I mean, that is a very trippy passage.
Yeah. There was an early trippy passage. I think it was the first one that really threw me for a loop.
Is it the one on page 63?
Yes. Yes, it is. A woman is sitting on a dais above an immense carven desk. She has a snake around her neck. The entire room is lined with books and strange fish swimming in colored globes. There are maps and charts on the wall, maps of Paris before the plague, maps of the antique world of Gnosis and of Carthage before and after the salting. In the corner of the room, I see an iron bedstead, and on it a corpse is lying. The woman gets up wearily, removes the corpse from the bed, and absent-mindedly throws it out the window. She returns to the huge carven desk, takes a goldfish from the bowl, and swallows it. Slowly, the room begins to revolve, and one by one, the continents slide into the sea. Only the woman is left, but her body is a mass of geography. I lean out the window, and the Eiffel Tower is fizzing champagne. It is built entirely of numbers and shrouded in black lace. The sewers are gurgling furiously. There are nothing but roofs everywhere, laid out with execrable geometry cunning. I have been ejected from the world like a cartridge. A deep fog has settled down. The earth is smeared with frozen grease. I can feel the city palpitating, as if it were a heart just removed from a warm body. The windows of my hotel are festering, and there is a thick, acrid stench as of chemicals burning. Looking into the Seine, I see mud and desolation, street lamps drowning, men and women choking to death, the bridges covered with houses, slaughterhouses of love. A man is standing against a wall with an accordion strapped to his belly. His hands are cut off at the wrists, but the accordion writhes between his stumps like a sack of snakes. The universe has dwindled. It is only a block long, and there are no stars, no trees, no rivers. The people who live here are dead. They make chairs which other people sit on in their dreams. In the middle of the street is a wheel, and in the hub of the wheel a gallows is fixed. People already dead are trying frantically to mount the gallows, but the wheel is turning too fast. So strange, man.
So strange. It kind of comes out of nowhere. Like
Yeah.
that one, I marked that one because I was like, wait, what? Because up until this point, he's basically just kind of telling you things are happening, blah, blah, blah. And then suddenly this woman's throwing a corpse out of the window.
Yeah, that was the first one in the book. It's about 60 pages in, and he's at somebody's house. He goes into like their study, and then this surreal fantasy just, and then there's a paragraph break, and then he's on to some other random idea.
Yeah.
And it takes a while for you to get a feel for the book, I think, because there's no, I mean, he does character descriptions really well later in the book, but early on, you're just thrown names as if they mean anything, but they don't. And it's really hard to get a sense of what's happening, where it's taking place, why these people are interacting this way. But then once you get into the flow of it, and you kind of just accept what Miller's doing, I think it moves along much better, but it takes a good 60, 70, maybe even 100 pages to really get a sense of what's happening.
And bring it back to Proust. It is a lot like Proust in that way. And Proust, I enjoyed reading. I definitely got into the rhythm of Proust, but I find it still to be a very uneven read. It's like there's stuff that you wade through, and then you're struck with brilliant passages. And I feel the same way about this. I feel the same way about Sexus, and you just kind of accept his way of getting there. And this and Proust, the whole thing, I think, feels genuine. Like it's not like there's good writing and bad writing exactly. It's just he's exploring different things, and I don't know. How do you feel about there's an aspect of the parts of this book that are clipped out and shared are the parts that are not about food and bed bugs and prostitutes.
Usually not, yeah.
And like you said, those are, they're not our favorites. They're maybe not the best parts of the book. And the book is somewhat uneven. You have these surreal passages, you have the philosophy, and you have these day in the life passages. What's the value of reading it all together like this?
I have a few responses to that, but first I'd like to read a passage from Tropic of Cancer that refers to Proust and Matisse, because I think there's part of the answers in that quote. So he stumbles into a museum, I believe, or an art gallery, and he sees some Matisse paintings. And he says, I find myself in a world so natural, so complete that I am lost. I have the sensation of being immersed in the very plexus of life, focal from whatever place, position, or attitude I take my stance. Lost is when once I sank into the quick of a budding grove, and seated in the dining room of that enormous world of Balbec, I caught for the first time the profound meaning of those interior stills which manifest their presence through the exorcism of sight and touch. Standing on the threshold of that world which Matisse has created, I re-experienced the power of that revelation which had permitted Proust to so deform the picture of life that only those who, like himself, are sensible to the alchemy of sound and sense are capable of transforming the negative reality of life into the substantial and significant outlines of art. I think that last line is key. Transforming the negative reality of life into the substantial and significant outlines of art. We kind of talked about how Miller he's doing a few different things. He's searching for some authenticity in life, and I think a lot of that comes through artistic freedom. In the book, he's living this sort of transient existence. He's not bound by social norms, and I think he wants that to come out in the art as well, because it's such a part of the human condition, I guess we can call it that. He's pushing freedom of expression. He's pushing expression of reality as he sees it. He's doing this thing, and you talked about him being a mystic, right? And most of us don't associate the mystics with the profane, but
Yeah.
I think he's combining these things of sacredness and profanity in a way. So I think there's a few different things happening all at once, and he's pushing the reader into uncomfortable territory on purpose. It certainly feels that way. It certainly feels intentional.
Would you say then that the experience of reading the quotable the passages that you would put on a poster on your wall,
Yeah.
sandwiched between passages that you would not admit to your mother that you were reading, that
Like
having
early on when he's talking about sleeping with Tanya,
should I read a passage that
that you probably wouldn't put on your wall?
yes, and mother, if you are listening, now's a good time to turn off this episode. Oh, Tanya, where now is that warm cunt of yours? Those fat, heavy garters, those soft, bulging thighs. There is a bone in my prick 6 inches long. I will ream out every wrinkle in your cunt, Tanya, big with seed. I will send you home to your Sylvester with an ache in your belly and your womb turned inside out. Your Sylvester. Yes, he knows how to build a fire, but I know how to inflame a cunt. I shoot hot bolts into you, Tanya. I make your ovaries incandescent. Your Sylvester is a little jealous now. He feels something, does he? He feels the remnants of my big prick. I have set the shores a little wider. I have ironed out the wrinkles. After me, you can take on stallions, bulls, rams, drakes, St. Bernards. You can stuff toads, bats, lizards up your rectum. You can shit arpeggios if you like, or string a zither across your navel. I am fucking you, Tanya, so that you will stay fucked. And if you are afraid of being fucked publicly, I will fuck you privately. I will tear off a few hairs from your cunt and paste them on Boris's chin. I will bite into your clitoris and spit out 2 franc pieces.
You would be alarmed if someone put that in a sort of inspirational
scripty
quote meme. Yeah.
There is a real pleasure to reading Henry Miller out loud, I have to say. It really has a rhythm.
Yes, he loves a good list, and he loves building steam behind his list of insanity and profanity. It's great. It is very fun to read out loud, as we have noticed over the past couple of days here doing this, that just every time I start reading it aloud, I'm like, oh, this is much better than it was in my head.
Yeah, I have the same feeling. Because like a passage like that, maybe mostly like uh, feel a little bit revolted.
Yeah, a little bit. But it's also, it seems, I mean, it is revolting if you take it very literally. I think that's the thing. I think you have to accept that he's having a lot of fun.
Yeah. Which is a strange thing to accept.
Yes.
And I think it also, we mentioned this before, I think there's this feeling of authenticity, which is very important to the book. But then there's also this humor. Obviously, that passage I just read is not really reflective of a reality. It's reflective of a feeling or impression about reality, which we assume he feels, but it's possible he only feels that in once he sits down to write it. So it's a genuine piece of writing if it wasn't a genuine feeling in the moment. And that's an interesting balance that he strikes. Like, who is Henry Miller actually? What is this experience actually? And it's almost, does it matter? And maybe this is what separates this book from being a memoir or being an autobiography or journalism about what's going on in Paris. But I think that it's something I think to appreciate about the writing when an author can do that. That it doesn't need to adhere to the facts exactly, even if it's expressing something true.
He's capturing his perception of the world, which is absurd, chaotic, indifferent, where these individual peoples have these strong desires and needs, and they're often repressed. And he's sort of kicking the doors open and saying, yeah, this is what people are thinking. This is what we're thinking about. This is what we're really thinking about sometimes.
It makes me think of this quote from that Orwell piece. He said Orwell's talking about writing about World War I and how the only books worth reading about World War I are written by soldiers, not by anybody who actually, soldiers don't have any idea what's going on. So they're not experiencing, or they can't tell you what the truth is. Like, what are they doing on this battlefield? What are the numbers? What are the facts? And he says he's likelier to make a good book out of his helplessness and his ignorance than out of a pretended power to see the whole thing in perspective. And I think that also applies to maybe to this. And it's like
an experience of radical perspective.
yeah. There's this idea of presenting the world as it is, or presenting the world truthfully. And I think that you and I both had this experience reading this. It's like, it's not totally relatable. It's not, I don't read this and honestly, I don't read this and think like, oh, this is what he's talking about, what's going on in my head. I'm sure that there are people, and maybe at the time, people would have read this. The ordinary man, whoever that is, would have read this and said like, oh, finally somebody's putting in print what I've been thinking already. So, is it worthwhile to read what might have been going on? We kind of almost have taken on faith, right? Or maybe put that as a question. Do we just have to take it on faith that Henry Miller's being honest here about what's going on in the ordinary man's head? Or is there some quality in the writing that sort of transcends any given time or place, and we can just understand that there's something authentic here in his writing? He's not pretending. He's not sugarcoating it or being profane for the sake of being profane, that he's really writing something genuine, and there's something inherently valuable in that. Because I guess there's something, if he comes around, he says, okay, this is the world that I'm living in, these are the trenches I'm fighting in, or whatever, and we think, well, I've never fought in trench warfare. So I can't confirm or deny whether that's the authentic experience. And then the moral of the story is, duty, honor, whatever. And that's easy to accept because we say, well, duty, honor, I agree with that. So then I can accept the version of the story that he's telling. But Henry Miller is this funny combination of the events of his life that he's relating and the way that he's perceiving people, describing events isn't, well, there's certainly large parts of it that aren't that relatable. It's kind of, there's a sort of, certainly a crudeness and at times a mean-spiritedness. And then the moral of it is kind of leave the world behind. The moral is the world is burning. Don't worry about it, which also flies in the face of a sort of, the village morality, the sort of the confirmation that, okay, well, he's come around to a position that I can agree with, so I can accept the experiences that he's had.
So he says, it may be that we are doomed, that there is no hope for us, any of us. But if that is so, then let us set up a last agonizing, blood-curdling howl, a screech of defiance, a war whoop. Away with lamentation, away with elegies and dirges, away with biographies and histories and libraries and museums. Let the dead eat the dead. Let us living ones dance about the rim of the crater. A last expiring dance. But a dance. I think that's kind of his philosophy. We are at the crater, on the rim, and there's those that look down and lament and see the horror, the chaos, whatever it is, and they just kind of collapse into it. And then there's those remaining few that can still dance at the edge. And I think that's what he's doing, right? That's certainly what the book as a whole feels like.
I'd be curious to somebody for whom this message is very, very much an affront to their own worldview. Because I think I am a little bit sympathetic to this idea, to his pacifism, his commitment to art, his commitment to individuality, his commitment to honesty. Like those are values that I also, maybe not as extreme a way as Henry Miller, but those are values that I hold above many other values. And so there's, I guess, I'm a little bit more of a willing reader here.
I think you'd have to be, because it is, as a book, as a work, and Miller as a writer seems to be an affront to so many, especially when he was writing, but I think it's still relatively true, so many sacred cows of a functioning society.
Yeah, and maybe this is a good time to drop in another Orwell quote about the sort of environment that he was writing in.
Yeah.
Communists and near-communists had a disproportionately large influence in the literary reviews. It was a time of labels, slogans, and evasions. At the worst moments, you were expected to lock yourself up in a constipating little cage of lies. At the best, a sort of voluntary censorship. Ought I to say this? Is it pro-fascist? Was at work in nearly everyone's mind. It is almost inconceivable that good novels should be written in such an atmosphere. Good novels are not written by orthodoxy sniffers, nor by people who are conscience-stricken about their own unorthodoxy. Good novels are written by people who are not frightened. And this brings me back to Henry Miller. So that's George Orwell in this Inside the Whale essay.
And I think that last line is where people get that sense of authenticity and genuineness, is fearlessness. A disregard for how anyone might view him or think about him or judge him, and just whatever's inside, even if it's being silly, playful, horrible, whatever it is, this is what's in my head. This is what's coming out. This is what I'm feeling in my gut, I guess, is more Miller than it is head. And it's just, or his prick, as he would say. And it's just, it's just coming out of him,
And so do you think you can sort of read in sort of between the words whether or not an author feels that there's somebody looking over their shoulder? Like, and if the author sounds like somebody's looking over their shoulder, then we have a sort of instinct to tune that out because it doesn't feel like we're really engaging with them. And that's kind of what you're describing. Miller's just, he's speaking for himself.
Yeah. And in a way that still has a lot of the things that you like in prose. So it's still writerly, you know? There's still a poetry to it, a rhythm. It's very musical, as we were just talked about when you read it out loud. So it still has the qualities of that, but yeah, it feels very unburdened by anything. Yeah.
This reminds me of something that a friend of mine who's a writer, Casey Stegman, told me. He said, if when he's talking to other writers, he's like, have you ever written something that you just feel absolutely embarrassed about? It's like, that's probably the good one. That's probably the good stuff that you're ashamed to show anybody. It was like, that maybe then you've gotten to something that you accidentally wrote something down without that person looking over your shoulder. And now you're like, oh, don't look at it now.
So we've kind of talked about reconciling some of the pornographic parts. Do we want to get into how to reconcile anti-Semitism and racism?
I don't have anything sort of highlighted. I mean, it might be worth getting into since we were kind of touching on the offensive parts of this book.
I don't really know how to respond to the anti-Semitism, I think is the issue.
I mean, the book's dated.
Yeah.
That's how I feel about it. Is like he was expressing views that were not uncommon at the time.
No.
And he expresses anti-Semitic stereotypes and tropes. He expresses anti-Black stereotypes and tropes. I mean, in any group, basically, you name it, and he expresses those stereotypes. So I don't think that he's making any sort of point about it. I think it's like he's writing. I mean, it's like you take what he's saying because he's not looking over his shoulder to see if the thought police is coming to get him. Are they gonna not let him say that? And is it reprehensible that he would have or express these views? Sure. If you want to live in a fair society, sure, it's reprehensible. But I think that maybe if we want to like steelman the case of him writing about these things, or writing, it's not really about these things, writing in such a way, it's the same thing that we're saying. To write sincerely, not to worry about whether you're a good or bad person, not to be afraid of whether or not you're going to be ostracized from the village.
Yeah. And he does seem pretty open that he is a bad person. I mean, bad in terms of how he functions in modern society.
Yeah, and I think he sort of like the passage that we read before where he's describing himself literally as the devil. I think he's mocking the sort of conventional village morality. I don't think he actually sees himself as a bad person because he doesn't buy into that idea of morality. No. I think
he makes reference to Nietzsche quite a few times. He's beyond good and evil.
I think of, and maybe this is why I can sympathize with him a little bit, because he's not inauthentic. He's not lying to himself. He's not a coward. He's not buying into a herd mentality. He's not expressing ideas that he doesn't believe in. And he's doing all of those things for a moral reason, because it's the right thing to do. It just so happens that the expression of his morality flies in the face of the moral code of his society and of our society for the most part. But that's why I say that Henry Miller is, or I understand Henry Miller to be quite a moral writer, because I think that he's not nihilistic exactly. He's not lazy. He's doing something deliberate. He's living deliberately for a reason. I think it's worth talking about Miller's particular relationship and the position that he takes towards modernity. And there's this great passage kind of around the same area where you were reading that Proust passage, and he's talking about Matisse and where the world is headed. More and more, the world resembles an entomologist's dream. The Earth is moving out of its orbit. The axis has shifted. From the north, the snow blows down in huge knife blue drifts. A new ice age is setting in. The transverse sutures are closing up, and everywhere throughout the corn belt, the fetal world is dying, turning to dead mastoid. Inch by inch, the deltas are drying out, and the riverbeds are smooth as glass. A new day is dawning, a metallurgical day, when the earth shall clink with showers of bright yellow ore. As the thermometer drops, the form of the world grows blurred. Osmosis there still is, and here and there articulation. But at the periphery, the veins are all varicose. At the periphery, the light waves bend and the sun bleeds like a broken rectum. And a little bit further down, the wallpaper with which the men of science have covered the world of reality is falling to tatters. The grand whorehouse, which they have made of life, requires no decoration. It is essential only that the drains function adequately. Beauty, that feline beauty which has us by the balls in America, is finished. To fathom the new reality, it is first necessary to dismantle the drains, to lay open the gangrene ducts which compose the genitourinary system that supplies the excreta of art. The odor of the day is permanganate and formaldehyde. The drains are clogged with strangled embryos. And moving on a little bit further. In the evening, now and then, skirting the cemetery walls, I stumble upon the phantom odalisques of Matisse fastened to the trees, their tangled manes drenched with sap. A few feet away, removed by incalculable aeons of time, lies the prone and mummy-swathed ghost of Baudelaire, of a whole world that will belch no more. In the dusky corners of cafes are men and women with hands locked, their loins slather-flecked. Nearby stands the garçon with his apron full of sous, waiting patiently for the entr'acte in order to fall upon his wife and gouge her. Even as the world falls apart, the Paris that belongs to Matisse shudders with bright, gasping orgasms. The air itself is steady with a stagnant sperm, the trees tangled like hair. On its wobbly axle, the wheel rolls steadily downhill. There are no brakes, no ball bearings, no balloon tires. The wheel is falling apart, but the revolution is intact.
In an earlier passage, I mentioned when it was talking about his optimism, he refers to himself as a man of the 19th century. And I think you're reading Sexus, which talks about his job when he lived in New York. And there's a passage in here somewhere about New York, about how it's this lifeless, cold, mechanical, busy, hectic space. And when he lived in New York, he worked for like a telegraph company, which, back then was technological and fast-paced and modern. And you can tell he hated that sense of movement. And he even has a book, I think, about his time traveling in America when he took like a road trip, and he called it The Air-Conditioned Nightmare because it described that sense of claustrophobia and business and profit, and that's things that seem anathema to him in a way that probably would, given his drive and perspective of the world. It's funny that a book that feels so progressive in its own way comes from a man who, in his mind, is so stuck in the past and is afraid of progress in other ways, in societal ways, not necessarily in artistic expression.
And what this speaks to me about is how this spectrum, or this conflict between these two poles, is always at play, and it feels new today. And I think that's the thing, is it always feels new. It always feels like there's something urgent. It always feels like the world is falling apart. It always feels like it's collapsing. This is the end of times. The earth is going to end if you do not act now, if you do not vote now. Hitler is rising to power. Do something now. Join the communists now. It's all falling apart. All the glory days are in the past. We're never going back. And I don't know if Baudelaire and Matisse felt that way, but I think reading Henry Miller and maybe, maybe we swing in this pendulum, and Orwell talks about how the 20s were very much this pendulum swing towards art for art's sake. And, you, you don't write about something, you just write. And then the 30s swung back the other way, and it's not about style. It's all about, you need to write about truth, about the right cause, about the movement, about progress. And that you're always swinging back and forth. And I think with Henry Miller being so anachronistic in his time, and this is him saying, yeah, modernity is driving humanity off the cliff. It's funny that he says he's talking about global cooling. We're entering a new ice age. And I think that sort of provides, he's not totally naive about what's going on in the world, what people say is going on in the world. But I think he does lament it. He's saying that, there's other things that are important to care about, because this is always happening. The world is going to fall apart. The wheel is falling to pieces, but it continues to spin.
I think that's it. We never really talked about it, but are you ever frustrated with his navel gazing and narcissism? I think because he is so passionate that it never feels
like indulgent.
But it's indulgent in such a fun, bombastic way that where many books that are overly navel gazy, I don't know what the adjective would be, are usually people who are kind of mopey or overly critical about mundane things, and there's usually a sort of heavy, maudlin, depressive atmosphere about things. And that's, even though Miller talks about heavy, dark things, he does it in such an off-kilter, often tongue-in-cheek kind of silly way that it's really a fun reading experience.
Yeah, maybe the lesson is, if you're gonna write a navel-gazing novel, make sure that you're a likable person.
Yeah.
This passage about navel gazing is one of my favorites.
Oh, let's hear it.
Going back in a flash over the women I've known, it's like a chain which I forged out of my own misery, each one bound to the other, a fear of living separate, of staying born. The door of the womb always on the latch, dread and longing. Deep in the blood, the pull of paradise, the beyond, always the beyond. It must have all started with the navel. They cut the umbilical cord, give you a slap in the ass, and presto, you're out in the world, adrift, a ship without a rudder. You look at the stars, and then you look at your navel. You grow eyes everywhere, in the armpits, between the lips, in the roots of your hair, on the soles of your feet. What is distant becomes near. What is near becomes distant. Inner, outer, a constant flux, a shedding of skins, a turning inside out. You drift around like that for years and years, until you find yourself in the dead center. And there you slowly rot, slowly crumble to pieces, get dispersed again. Only your name remains.
There's another passage before that's great, but quickly, that passage that you just read, maybe this explains some of his womanizing.
Yeah.
This
sort of,
that he needs to belong, to have something that sort of tie him down. Because there is the sense, and it is just on the previous page, that he can't stand being alone. And silence infuriates him and drives him mad. Just literally, it says on the previous page, he's somewhere. Maybe this is when he's in Dijon and he's like truly alone. He's no longer in Paris with his buddies. He says, alone with a tremendous empty longing and dread, the whole room for my thoughts, nothing but myself and what I think, what I fear. Could think the most fantastic thoughts, could dance, spit, grimace, curse, wail. Nobody would ever know, nobody would ever hear. The thought of such absolute privacy is enough to drive me mad. It's like a clean birth, everything cut away, separate, naked, alone. Bliss and agony simultaneously. Time on your hands, each second weighing on you like a mountain. You drowned in it. Deserts, seas, lakes, oceans. Time beating away like a meat axe. Nothingness. The world. The me and the not me. Uma haruma uma. Everything has to have a name. Everything has to be learned, tested, experienced. Faites comme chez vous, chérie. There's almost this sense that he's writing everything that he can and feel to escape his loneliness.
And the loneliness from that last passage seems to be an existential loneliness. It's not just companionship, but this existential loneliness of like, what am I doing here and where am I going? And the writing and putting down everything is like making a place to say truly, here I am. There's like, I'm not hiding anything. There's nothing that's not here in my experience.
We all do something to escape the sense of insignificance. And for Miller, it is writing, that artistic drive. Even in the face of a sense of meaninglessness.
Thanks for listening to this conversation about Henry Miller's Tropic of Cancer, and thank you for joining us on Season 2. That is a wrap. So this is our last book on our list of books to read this season. We're going to do one more episode where we kind of summarize and go back and talk about the books and talk about the theme of control one more time. But thank you for listening. Thank you for reading. I hope you enjoyed it. Let us know. We'd love to hear from you. Leave us comments on Instagram or X, formerly Twitter, or leave us a review on iTunes. That's actually super helpful. Both, honestly, we really love to hear what you enjoyed about the episodes or what you didn't. And it's really helpful for other people to find the podcast. It's one of the best ways to get the word out. So if you enjoyed it, please do leave us a review. And if you want to go back and read any of the books and follow along in the episodes, you can make your purchase of the book on our website, booksofsomesubstance.com, and we get a little bit of a kickback from our affiliate links, and that helps the podcast. So, Season 3 will be coming. I'm not going to give you any spoilers about the date or the theme yet. That will be coming, so look forward to that. And until next time, happy reading. We want to say a special thank you to Donna in Vancouver, Washington for supporting the podcast. If you want to support the podcast, go to our website at booksofsomesubstance.com, where you can make a donation, buy your books through our affiliate links, or purchase some Boss merchandise. All this goes to help support the podcast and keeps things running smoothly over here at Books of Some Substance.